Kayak anglers of the internet, welcome back to another Advanced Kayak Anglers podcast. I'm your host tonight, Kurt Smits. Dan, the man, is hanging out with his family tonight. He has some stuff going on with his kids, so I'm going to take over again tonight. But we have a topic tonight that's near and dear to my heart. I even before bass fishing, I started fishing for hybrids and stripers around where I live locally. And we got some of the best guys to talk about it tonight. And we are going to go ahead and get started with it tonight. And we have Jeff Little with us tonight. We have Chris Bryant with us tonight. And Charlie with us tonight. Guys, how you guys all doing?
Doing good.
Good night.
We all have like a passion for striper fishing. And it's a little different than the passion for like regular bass fishing, right? I mean, it's a lot of different techniques in some cases. Some of you guys have definitely different gear. It's like saltwater. That's Jeff. I know you're a little bit in the saltwater. So, man, I am really excited about tonight's topic because this is something that has always been in my blood. Ever since like the first time I went fishing, I caught a little hybrid, and it was just like a really cool experience. So, we'll just start with you, Jeff. Why don't you kind of tell us who you are? I mean, most people know who you are, but I think some people could probably use a little refresher.
Sure. My name's Jeff Little, and I got a YouTube channel called The Little Stuff, which is very educational in nature because it's the little stuff that makes the difference between fishing and catching. And I do have a striped bass playlist on the YouTube channel. You can also follow me on Instagram. It's Jeff Little Kayak Fishing. The striper stuff that I have on there is predominantly the Chesapeake Bay, but I do have some content from further up in New England because you got to chase these fish in the Atlantic, as they migrate north. Otherwise, you're left with catching smaller fish during the summer. The bigs run up to New England. So,
and I tell you, that's one of the first ways I've found out who you were, Jeff, was actually striper fishing. I was Googling striper fishing, and then I stumbled across your smallmouth videos, and then we became friends eventually. So, man, thanks for coming on tonight.
Sure.
Chris, I heard about you through Ryan Lambert years ago, and I started following you years ago, and it's you catch some monsters, and you're catching them freshwater though, right? Correct?
Yeah.
You're catching them in streams and rivers and stuff. So why don't you kind of fill us in on who you are and where you fish?
So, yeah, I'm from Tennessee, so I have to catch them in freshwater. There's not a heck of a lot of saltwater in Tennessee. So I'm stuck with the freshwater variety. So it's a little bit different. There's still some seasonal migration and movement, kind of like what Jeff runs into, but your techniques are really getting dialed into what the fish want in that area because you're trying to trigger a lot of reaction bites. Saltwater fish tend to move a lot. There's a lot more bait. What you're looking for in freshwater is where are these fish going to be, where they're going to be set up, and how can you convince them to come off the bottom or come out from behind a current break and chase your lure down. And then there's also the size difference. Freshwater fish, especially in some of the places I fish here in the middle and mid-eastern Tennessee, get really, really, really thick. You'll have some really big fish, even in a river. So it's a different ballgame. They're not interested in chasing down 5-6 inch baits. These guys want 9, 10, 11, 12 inches. The live bait game, you can push 12 inches, 20 inches if you want. A little hard to manage in a kayak, so I tend to stick with artificial stuff. But I started fishing for them about 15 years ago. I was fishing a bass tournament with a buddy out of his boat, caught a 30-inch striper, and that was it for greenfish. So after one of those ripped off a ton of drag with a crankbait, and we chased it down, and he was ready to go back to bass fishing, I was hooked at that point. And it's been I call it a passion. My wife calls it an obsession or an addiction ever since then. So, that's how I met Charlie. Kurt, I know I've talked to you since hybrids as well, chased those guys as well in freshwater. But it's been a kind of a passion for me. And it's refined everything I did, even to the point of stealing saltwater techniques and moving them to freshwater because it is essentially the same fish. Years of evolution don't just go away.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the things I wanted to talk about tonight, some of the crossover techniques. So keep that in mind when we talk a little bit later. Charlie, man, tell us about you a little bit. I don't know you personally here. I just recently started kind of seeing you on social media.
unfortunately, I'm not real good about keeping up with social media, so a lot of that stuff's not current. My name's Charlie. I'll save you my last name. Everybody calls me Charlie P. I work at Jackson Kayak as a customer service representative. Used to build boats out there, and naturally, just became immersed in the kayak fishing community. But caught a few stripers here and there in the past, just by happenstance. And then one year I hooked up with Chris and really tried to figure him out. And it turned into, you guys are calling it a passion, but it really turned into an obsession, especially in our river systems. A lot of these areas are, dependent on generation. What the fish do depends on the generation. So, I'm constantly, every year I will pull up a chart that's got a graph of when they generated and when that generation happened on a water table, way downstream, on a water gauge way downstream, and I'll time it. Now we have to do that every year because sometimes, when they blow out the river in the winters, the contour changes and those flow times will vary. And a lot of where we fish and how we fish depends on when and how that water is falling. So yeah, it turns into an obsession. There's a lot of homework to do. We obviously don't post pictures of the fish we don't catch. So there are a lot of times we go out there and just beat ourselves up for 10, 12, 15 hours, sometimes, and never catch a fish. But there those few in between, those 30, 40, 50s are the ones that make it worthwhile.
And those are giant fish compared to what I am used to. I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, so I'm fishing the Ohio River mainly and its tributaries for them. And if I catch something over 25 inches is like a stellar fish down here. Anything over that is just you're not getting those every year, essentially, where I live. Or they're very, very few and far between when you do get them.
And I think about that often because I'm fairly new and I see people in other parts of the country catching fish and I caught a PB or caught this one's huge and it's 27 inches and those are the fish and not to sound conceited or anything or maybe we're just spoiled, but those are some of the fish that Chris and I don't even bother taking pictures of.
Right, exactly.
I'll admit to being a full-on snob. We've gotten to the point now where the fish we really get excited about are 40 inches or better.
Gosh, yeah.
And it is to the point, some of these rivers, once we've kind of figured it out, we're sight fishing to those fish in 3 feet of water in a crystal clear river. So you're standing by and you're watching, a 30-inch fish cruise by, and you just kind of look at it and admire it and don't even throw at it. Because you're waiting for that 40-incher that's coming down maybe 10 yards down the river. And it sounds really, really obscene and just really odd. But that's kind of what we've done. And it kept it fun. It's everybody that started off fishing was happy just to catch a fish. And then you wanted to catch a lot of fish. And the more people go on, they tend to specialize. How can I catch a fish with this method or this size or this particular species or in this particular spot? This was kept it fresh for me for, I guess, kayak fishing for 15 years, fishing since I was 12. It just ever evolving and it makes it fun. And now I'm still stuck on the big striped fish that pull really, really hard.
So I'm going to ask a question of Charlie and Chris and kind of load in that if we're catching them, say I run up to Maine and I hang out with Mike Baker, who's a kayak fishing guide up there in Maine. If I hang out with him for, I can't go up and fish with him for a day. It has to be 4 days of fishing, but it's not days. It's at night. It's all nocturnal. It is all, I go to his house. I usually show up, late afternoon and, he'll ask me, hey, are you well rested? I'm like, yeah, I slept good last night. He's like, okay, we're gonna load up and go here after we eat dinner, and we'll go out until till the sun comes up, and catch them at night, usually on gravity tackle eels and a 1/4 ounce jig head that we're just kind of swimming them through what we find. You use the side imaging and you just cruise around until you see them on side imaging. you shut down the Torquedo or pedal drive or whatever. You were running Torquedos, and you just start launching it out there, and you just start swimming it through there, and one of them will jam it, but it's nighttime. And I've fished with them during the day in the summer. Yeah, you catch those, mid-20s fish, but like we have days where we surf launch at night to get out to a spot, and you got a shot at like just losing track of how many 40 plus inch fish you catch. But it only happens if it goes at night. So the question to you guys is, how much nocturnal striper fishing are you guys doing in freshwater?
Quite a bit, I'd say. It really depends on the season too. So springtime is going to be a low light situation, typically dusk dawn. Once the sun's up, that's pretty well it. Summer, where me and Charlie tend to fish a lot, summer's weird. And that's kind of the only way to describe it, because it is so determined by generation to a point. These fish have become the apex predator in their environment, and anything coming through, whether it's a sucker, large bait fish, large shad, large skipjack herring, becomes prey immediately. So that's what you're trying to trigger. So the nighttime bites, I'd say that's where we get our numbers. We set up on certain spots with generation schedule being ideal. And I mean, a good night, we'll catch I'd say about a dozen, ranging from 36 to 42 inches in the same spot, like sitting in the same shoal, just waiting a really shallow spot. And then we'll float down river and wait for the sun to come up and continue the trip. I know some of our trips have started at 9 p.m. and finished at 4 p.m. the next day. So it's a lot of time in a kayak on a river. And then Sundays, we're usually dead and don't want to talk to anybody. But during the day, that's when we can actually sight fish, and we're looking on low water. So those fish they're aggressive and they're moving. You just got to be hyper aware. So it is possible your numbers are going to come at night, kind of like what you're running into. But that element of stalking a fish comes in during the day, and you do got to go full stealth mode. You can be, dead silent on a kayak, and you shift your weight one time and send a pulse out, and it's alerted every fish in that run. And now you might get them to bite. Once they've spotted you, forget it. It's very, very rare once you see a fish sees you to turn on. Even sometimes a splash of the lure can affect them. And it depends on what mood they're in. A 8-ounce lure splashing down can get them turned on and they love it, come after it, or it can send them running for the hills. So
consider an inflatable kayak. I've been using inflatables a lot recently, and there's some sort of noise insulating factor of when you shift in your seat and the seat frame creaks or any number of things that transfers, to the water. That compressed gas bubble that you're sitting on eats that. I mean, it makes you more stealthy. Just something to think about.
Those inflatable kayaks are the ultimate in stealth, man. If you're shallow water in it, there's nothing that's quieter.
For sure. So it's funny. You spoke to the generation, like their I guess hydroelectric generator, and they're releasing water, and that's the strike trigger, or that's the thing that kicks off their feeding activity, and that makes sense to me as a river smallmouth angler. I know on the new, we always look at, okay, are they generating? You never go down to fish the new on the weekends because they don't hydroelectric generate out of Clater Lake on the weekends. They do it during the week. So you go there Monday through Friday instead of Saturday, Sunday, because you're not going to get that slug of water coming through. So that I understand. But in terms of, you're saying you get numbers at night and bigs during the day by stalking, it's the opposite with the striper, and it's everywhere. Like there's, for the longest time, my biggest it was, I think, 45.5 inches, and I caught it within a line of sight of M&T Bank Stadium on a mud flat that was about 6 to 8 feet deep. Middle of the night, January, and I mean, it was like 2:30 in the morning when this thing hit. And it took off and started peeling off drag I had a 7-inch, soft plastic bait like a sluggo on a 1-ounce jig head. And it just, I used 20-pound braid and a 30-pound fluorocarbon leader. And it took off underneath the skim ice heading towards, all of the, shopping carts and other debris that's there because it's Baltimore. And, I thought for sure I'm not landing this thing, but I did. But I fished that area in January and February during the day and caught, 25 to 32 inch fish, but not a 40 plus. That happened in the middle of the night. So it's like, I know that fish is there out in front of, in that 50-foot channel, shipping channel in front of Fort McHenry. They're there all winter, but they're not eating when they're down there. They only eat when they come up shallow. Right. And it's just really an interesting take. And it's different in the spring. In the spring, you can get them during the day, shallow. Jameson Redding and I did an episode for his TV show, The Road Trip Angler, and we each got a fish over 40 inch from the kayak. It was a tough bite this spring. Our numbers are down, like just the numbers of striper, at least in the Chesapeake, is way down. But
I'm a bit jealous of that episode, Jeff. Because my episode was supposed to be the striper episode. But it was a little bit early in the season. And they hadn't done of course here it's a mock spawn run. That's kind of what we look to kick it off in the shallow water fisheries. But yeah, Jameson showed up a little bit earlier than we wanted him to. Of course, you're tied down by production schedule, so you can't do anything about that. So I was supposed to be the striper episode, but I'm glad you got to have it.
Yeah. It worked out.
Give people a little bit of background on stripers. They're actually a saltwater fish that can live in fresh water, but they won't necessarily reproduce. I believe there's one lake in the country that they will reproduce in fresh water, but it's still not like in great numbers.
I don't know if I totally agree with what you just said, Kurt. I think it's tricky for them to reproduce. My understanding, and I've watched them reproduce right where the Susquehanna dumps into the top of the Chesapeake Bay, and it's one big female and then other males just ramming into her. And honestly, I mean, it is violent, and it looks like someone just took a gallon of milk every 5 minutes and just dumped it where those fish are, just eggs and milk everywhere. They're broadcast spawners. Yeah. What I've read is that they need, and I've read some fisheries biologists like research things on, all right, how do we get this to work? And there is natural reproduction happening in Liberty Reservoir in Maryland is one that I know of.
That's the one I read about.
Okay. I think there's others. Yeah, I don't know if Smith Mountain Lake is one of them, but what it requires is a strong enough flow coming into that reservoir. And
there's something about the salt water, them living in salt water for part of the year and then coming into, I mean, I'm not a biologist. I went into the deep end on it too with you on there, Jeff. It's interesting because when you talk to biologists, they have set standards when they say reproduction's happening, because for them, reproduction happening is like sustaining a population in some cases. And in other cases, they're just looking for any reproduction happening.
Right.
And I believe, as much as like, the biologists like to, and other scientists like to think that they know everything, it's nature, man. These fish are reproducing in some ways because
they find a way.
I've seen great big ones up super shallow, way back streams doing exactly what you just said, Jeff. Yeah. And they were just getting hammered by fish. And I'm like, man, I can't say it was reproducing because I didn't go back and catch any fry, but they were doing it. Yeah. I mean, they weren't just like running up there and then running back out. They were running up and holding this one flat, and it was like a sand flat. And it was the only sand flat in this whole creek. And I mean, they were probably 6 miles from the Ohio River, maybe 7. I mean, they were way back there. It was at a very high water stage. So they were able to get
once it fertilizes, it needs a certain amount of flow to stay up in the water column or stay in suspension.
Yeah, I think otherwise it has to be able to
gets to the bottom and just gets covered with silt, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think the egg has to tumble for 72 hours
Okay.
without uninterrupted. Otherwise, it's not going to fertilize correctly. And most rivers inland, there's not that kind of flow. There's not a strong enough flow for that long for it to happen.
Yeah, so for me, it's like between Ohio, West Virginia, um, stocking the Ohio River. That's where I'm getting all mine from. And there's a few lakes up in the tributaries.
I think of so many different lakes that have them. Like I think of Raystown in Pennsylvania, and they have big stripers out there, and it's like, are they all ones that were stocked? I can't imagine. Like, and I know there is a lot of stocking to hey, let's have a striper fishery, and that's cool. But I can't imagine that it's only Liberty Reservoir that has a natural sustaining population of them. I mean, if that's the truth, that's just weird.
Yeah, I mean, I know here, like the Ohio, they stock tens of millions of them over the whole state. Like the lake near me, East Fork Lake, they get like 1 million fingerlings every year. But the conditions here aren't as conducive as where you guys are. Yeah. Obviously, Jeff, you're fishing them in a natural environment. You guys are fishing them in a much cleaner, I'm assuming cleaner water environment than I'm seeing them, or at least an environment that's more sustainable to get them to be big. Because, when I see my biggest ones are during huge rain events, and that's because I'm getting them from the next pool up. That's a lot less pressured. The next pool up, there aren't any big cities on it. So it just gets a lot less pressure. And where West Virginia stocks them is at the head of that pool. And they're actually stocking true stripers versus Ohio stocks a lot of hybrids. Mm-hmm. So when we get a big water event, they flow over that dam and they come down my way. Right. Unfortunately, this year has not been a high water event, so I haven't seen too many bigs this year.
One of the things that helps us is most of the places we're fishing are river run reservoirs. Well, they keep that riverine kind of movement to it. So even major lakes out here, the water essentially flushes itself out every 2 days, even in a major impoundment. So with that much moving water, and then a ton of bait, of course, high bait numbers, you got fish that can run 15 miles in a day with no problem. They can chase down bait all day. So there is a lot of bait. It's, we have obviously gizzard shad, we got threadfin shad, skipjack herring, which are basically striper crack. And then some of the tributaries, cold water tributaries, you have trout, suckers, there's other fish that they're feeding on there as well. So as everything moves around, these fish just follow, and it seems like they're always around food. And it's kind of a weird thing in some of the rivers we fish. As we're floating down, one of the things that alerts us to kind of go on high alert and be ready to see a striper is we start seeing schools of buffalo or schools of sucker, which you wouldn't think of as typical striper forage, but me and Charlie both can tell you how many times have we been floating down a river, seen a bunch of buffalo, and then there's a 40-inch striper sitting right behind it.
So how big a buffalo are you seeing, and you're like, there's striper nearby?
Any size buffalo, honestly. I'm not sure what it is. So they could be 18 to 30-inch buffalo. You get some real big ones that'll pull up. And they're just easy to see because they're dark and they're big, look like a giant carp.
Yeah.
And then the sucker, usually white sucker, are going to be in the mix. Those are running 10 to 14 inches on average.
So big ones, man. I mean, that's for me. If I see 18 to 24-inch sucker, that's a pretty big, or a buffalo. That's a pretty big buffalo for around here.
And I don't know if they're eating the buffalo. I think it might be kind of that same kind of symbiosis where you have turkey and deer hanging out together. One is the eyes, the other is the nose and ears. Because if the buffalo gets spooked, the striper usually goes on high alert. I do think they are eating the sucker. That one, I'm kind of thinking that's happening because we don't see a lot of shad. Now, if you do see a pot of shad in the river, there's almost always a striper with it. They're just right on its tail. And I've had times in the middle of the day where I had a pot of shad use my kayak as shelter to get away from 2 30-inch stripers that are chasing it around. So I'm sitting there watching these fish cruise around and can't cast at them because they're too close.
Man, one of the first stories I have about getting hooked to striper fishing, I was one of the first time, it was like the second or third time, but one of the first times I was fishing for them, I was in this big tree brush pile, and I had snuck in there with my paddling crappy kayak, and all these shad, it was bright blue skies, man. Sun is beaming down, and I could see on my fish finder that all these shad moved up underneath me, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, these small, like, 12 to 18-inch hybrids moved in, and they were just pounding the shad all around me. They were coming up and hitting the kayak, pushing the shad into the kayak, hitting them off the wood. It was just like, and you'd see them run down through the wood and come back around. I sat there for hours having it was just just what you said, how you look for shad. In my area, it's all about the shad. There are skipjack around, but they move around in schools, and we don't have a lot of them. So it's kind of hard to look for skipjack, but it's easy to look for the shad, because the shads are big clouds around here. And it's like right now, because the water's so low, and as you talked about current, the Ohio is only moving like a mile an hour. It's like a great big lake. If the wind's blowing the opposite direction at all, you're getting pushed upriver. So it's all about the creek mouths right now, because that's the only place there's actually flowing water into the Ohio, causing some type of mix to happen. And it's basically, if you go to a creek mouth and there's no shad, might as well just leave, because there'll be no fish there at all. But if there's shad there, even if you don't see them right away, they're there someplace. They might be stuck to the bottom. They might be over in a drop someplace.
Are you using forward-facing sonar to scan for the bait fish?
I am. Now, I haven't found it super effective to target single big fish, but what I have found it to be incredibly great at is seeing when there's one log that's not that big in the water that has 2 or 3 big fish on it. And then I'm targeting it. I find the structure a little bit easier than I am finding to target the individual big fish with it.
What are you throwing on them? What baits?
Swim baits mostly.
Okay.
I mean, that's pretty much my go-to until it gets a little colder. Then it'll be like blade baits, lipless cranks. I keep trying them because they're stuck to the bottom. And what's interesting that you brought up forward-facing sonar, when I get to these spots, I'll sweep over it in the forward mode and look the whole area, and I won't see anything sometimes. If I throw my swim bait out there and drag it just over the bottom, all of a sudden you'll hit a spot where they just swarm out of nowhere and come up to it because they're so stuck to the bottom. The trick is get them to eat it, because they'll swarm up on it and I'll feel them bump it, but they're not eating it. They're just bumping into it.
So there's a lot that you can learn by looking at the body language of your school of bait fish. And like, I know if I can see a school of bait fish and it has kind of hazy, fuzzy edges and it's generally round, without real defined edges, like they're not stressed. They're not nervous. They're not looking around because they're like, ooh, stripers around. Whereas when you see schools of bait fish, especially if you can see, like, you usually see like a honeycomb where it's kind of tall, and if it's tight and there's well-defined edges to them, they're packed in really close because they're worried. They're like, oh, he's right over there. Is he coming over? And if you can see that shape, that blob of bait fish, and it has a weird kind of almost like for sure, if you see that Swiss cheese hole in there, there's going to be a dot in the middle, and that is an actual striper diving in to eat some of them. But sometimes it just has weird shapes like the Star Trek insignia that has that big arc, but then there's a part missing from the bottom. That's one coming up from underneath. Studying what the bait fish school looks like usually on side imaging, but like it works with forward facing as well. If you really, know how to interpret it. And that just comes with time. Like, you got to just, when we're out in the Chesapeake, or even running up through New England, we troll a lot, and that's how we find them. We cruise around, we set the torpedo so that we're, usually trolling 2 hard baits on either side. Like a Yozuri crystal flash minnow is one of my favorites. Alan Batista, who's written a bunch of books on striper fishing out of the kayak. Like, he should be on this podcast because he would. Alan knows a lot. And has written really good books. He's an engineer by trade, and it takes a very engineering approach to kayak fishing and striper fishing. Anyways, you have all this time. Like, the game in saltwater, especially in the Chesapeake, with the numbers as low as they are, you got to find them. And, for me to cruise for 8-9 hours and not get a knockdown, and all I'm doing is looking at side imaging and looking at old waypoints where I know, all right, on this tide they're gonna be on this kind of rip. Let's go find more of that as we move up into this tidal creek or whatever it is. You got to find them first, and then generally once you find them with trolling, then we can switch to the light tackle jigging. And that's for me, it's the more fun way to catch them, because it's, hey, I've found them. I know this ledge or rip or rip wrap or whatever it is, drop off, bridge piling, bottleneck type area that, that they're on. Then you can put those hard baits away and just take a 1 ounce jig head with a, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 inch, linear chunk of soft plastic, and just chuck it out there and let it pendulum swing down, hit the bottom, pop it up, and then just wait for it to get jammed. And yes, snapping it up will do it. Sometimes, like I talked about it with the gravity tackle eels up in New England. It isn't popping it off the bottom. It's just swimming it lazily through there. Well, that's an eel. Like, they're eating eels, and the eels just kind of, right through the middle of the water column, just kind of slowly reeling, and they jam it. So it's different strike triggers or different things once you do find them. But it is, at least in the striper, in the saltwater in the Chesapeake and up through New Jersey, Raritan Bay is great in April. It's finding them, and having the battery power in the Torpedo to just, like, the longest day that I had with a Torpedo, I did 41.8 miles, and I circumnavigated Kent Island. I did it with Marty Mood. About broke Marty. Marty was he was sore. I did it on one Torpedo battery. One, what are they, like 13-pound battery, 915
one battery.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I've always talked about with people about their Torpedo, man. Everyone wants to know, like, top end speed, this and that. And I'm like, man, there's a lot to be said about the efficiency over you're at 6.1 or 6.3. I mean, it's like, at that point, I'm like, it doesn't really matter that much.
I got a rig now that's hitting 7.6.
But do you want to run forever at 3 miles an hour? Or, you know what I mean? Like, if you want to troll, you can troll for amazing distances with a Torpedo.
So Monday and Tuesday down on Chickahominy Lake, and I ran up into the river and fished the river. I didn't fish the lake much, but I ran 9 miles in the morning to get up into the creek, up into the river, and then a little more than 9 miles coming back to the campground. And I did it twice. Now I did it quickly, and I could set the throttle at, okay, I'm at 100%. I've checked my distance, and I know that it's 9 miles or a little bit more than 9 miles to get to where I want to go. And I set the remaining range at 9 miles, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to exhaust one battery, and I'm cruising at like 5.4 mile an hour. Right. So I'm going to get up there in an hour and a half, roughly. Maybe an hour and 40 minutes. Whatever it took me just to zoom up there. But that's some of the number crunching that you do when you're striper fishing. I don't need to go 5.4 to troll for striper. Like 3 is good. And at 3 mile an hour, you know, a battery is going to last me. I mean, I can do 20 couple miles on a battery at 3.2 or whatever. I was doing 2.8 that day. I did 41.8 miles. Now I played the wind and tide to make that happen, but I made it happen. So
yeah. Well, you'd be dumb to play against it, right?
no, I brought a second battery, but I was like, I don't want to use it. I want to pull this off, and I did.
So I'm curious, Chris, you were mentioning earlier about some saltwater techniques that you brought over to freshwater fishing. I'm curious to hear, because so far I feel like we're all between me, Jeff, Charlie, and you, that I'm fishing very differently than all you guys are.
Yeah,
dramatically so.
So a lot of the techniques we're using, it's going to be more that surf game, and strictly because we're fishing below a lot of generating dams. If you can get up in the boils, you got the choppy water. It kind of lends itself to that. The jig and soft plastic is a staple in various sizes depending on location, the size of the fish. I'll do anything from, in the winter I like 4-inch baits because those fish are feeding on smaller thread fins, usually where they can get them packed in. Whereas early in the spring, as big as I can throw, honestly, your bait fish are all big at that point. Everything's grown out, and then as we move into fall, they kind of key on that real small stuff. But you're using those techniques. The thing that kind of plays in really well, though, are like surf casting lures. So the redfin, which was originally surf casting lure, the cotton cordell pencil poppers are fantastic, especially on rivers where you have flat sections and it looks like nothing. You throw a pencil popper and work it like you traditionally would in the surf, where you're whipping that rod, you're pumping it, and the lure's cutting back. And it looks ridiculous, honestly. People look at you like you're crazy. And you're just making a mess until they see a fish detonate on your lure. Or they start seeing it blow up. Then they kind of get it like, wait a minute. So that I like tsunami lures. Those are pretty good. I know they're saltwater heavy. They're swim shad style baits. Charlie likes spoons.
Yeah.
He likes throwing big spoons. And then we started getting into, that 8-foot, 9-foot rods to reach fish, which sounds obscene in a kayak. I've done it in certain areas where you can't get too close. So I'm taking a 10-foot surf rod in a kayak and like launching my lure way past everybody else. To reach fish that they can't. And it is working just kind of like what Jeff described. It's a straight whine for the most part with occasional twitches. The colder it gets, the more subtle the twitches. If the water warms up, you can get a little nuts with it. Ripping it off the bottom works. They seem to always hit it on the drop. If you come off structure and you feel that bait dropping, that's fantastic. There's a couple of dams I fish below in certain conditions. If I can get it to drop inside the bucket where the spillways are, as the water pushes it out, I can feel it drop off that lip. And at that point, I'm just reeling down, getting ready to set the hook because I know it's coming. Once I hit that sweet spot, fish are packed in that one spot. It is an immediate hit. So I like those things. The Magic Swimmer, that's a kind of a freshwater bait that's gotten really popular up in the New England coast for stripers when they're out in their runs, bigger fish. That's a really fun bait to fish, even in small rivers. You're throwing that thing out. 9-inch Magic Swimmer on a small river sounds weird. Burning it back at Mock Jesus is even weirder until it gets hit. And then it, middle of the morning, and I think Charlie's been out there when we've done this, throwing those baits in shoals, and you're ripping this thing across the surface, and it sounds like a bomb went off on a quiet river in the fog. It's insane.
So I know bass fishing, like largemouth and smallmouth, we talk about the drawing power of certain baits, right? And what that means is it going to motivate a big fish to like even come and check it out? And I know a lot of people are throwing the larger choppos have good drawing power. The mag drafts have good drawing power because it goes and it hits the surface and everything looks up at it, and your 14-inch fish cowers under the log, and the 21-inch says, "How dare you? I'm challenging." And he'll come out and maybe he doesn't eat it, but you get to see what's out there. One bait that has amazing drawing power, and it's funny. I've traveled up and down the coast from Virginia to Maine, and each area has its sort of this is how we do it here, right? For sure, the Chesapeake, a lot of light tackle jigging. You get into New Jersey and they troll they say tubes, but a bass angler is going to think of like tubes with tentacles, but it's surgical tubing that they do it because with a hook on the end of it. They do it because it looks like an eel, and then the bluefish that try to chew at the other stuff, like they can't chew up the surgical tubing the same way. So New Jersey, it's the tube. You go up further into like the Long Island Sound and even further up into New England. This is the bait I want you to try if you do top water. And it's the dumbest looking thing, but it works. And I think it's originally a musky bait. It's called the dock or the little dock.
Okay.
And it's a one knocker. You know what it is?
Green giant spook. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has a sort of like just a sonic signature that just it draws them up. They come up to find out. It just a regular bone colored dock or little dock, and they hear it. They come up to find out about it.
And there are lures I've stolen from the especially those surf guys up in the Northeast. So your metal lip lures like the Danny, Adam Swimmer, that's a really good one. Your bottleneck plugs, those are really good in current, stuff that you can work in ways that most people around here just simply wouldn't. The traditional method down here is cast up current, let current push it down, or you work it downstream. But there's places where that heavy current, you're going to do better. Instead of letting it swing, you're going to want to work that actively through current. And I'll let Charlie speak about this because this is something he kind of stumbled across as far as throwing a lure and burning it back up against current like a crazy person. What I was used to doing is throwing, NLB, you got your 8-inch NLBNs, lures of that size. Z-Man Mag Swims is another one I like a lot. The Gambler, really big EZ, it's 8 inches long, big soft plastic bait. Break those on a 1-ounce head, fire them upstream. Yeah, that Charlie's holding up, exactly. Fire it upstream, and then you reel back fast enough to get that tail to engage. And when we were doing it, and when the fish are in the area, as you're doing that, you have to brace the butt of the rod against your ribs to counter the shock of the strike, because they will absolutely stop it. And these are 40-inch fish. Yeah, it's pretty intense. But yeah, I'll let Charlie talk about this other methods we're using.
And it's kind of funny that just me doing that was just out of frustration and boredom. It was a point where I had cast it 100 times and not caught anything. So I was just aggravated and just doing one of those, reeling as hard as I could, and when I was trying to bring the lure back in, and it got slammed. So from then on, I thought, well, maybe that can't be a fluke. Again, it's unconventional to work a lure upstream, but I don't think these stripers care. I don't know if it's a reaction bite when it goes zooming the wrong way past them, and they just they chase it down and smoke it. But I've had a lot of luck doing it with that Gambler. And also with which they don't make anymore. Rapala used to make this. It was a storm kicking minnow. This one's broken because they always break. But this thing, very, very fragile. The first one I had lasted forever, so I thought it was an awesome lure, and it's great as far as the action. But it's got a bunch of components inside that. You might catch 2 fish before it breaks, and I think that's sort of why they discontinued it. But that's one of the ones that I used to throw religiously because the way it swam, it was a real tight wiggle, and it looked just like a skipjack running through the water. It didn't have a big side to side action. It's just it maybe wiggled an inch or two to either side, but it was real tight. And it was real flashy, and they loved it. Unfortunately, they don't make those anymore. So I'm trying to find somebody that makes something like that.
So there's within that larger profile bait fish lure, there are boot tails, there are the wedge tails, and then there are, I'm going to say, for lack of a better term, a brush tail. Chris and Charlie, do you have an opinion for when to throw each of those? I mean, are either of you throwing a wedge tail bait like the Mullitron, or there are other ones?
I know there's a K-tail from NLBN as well. Same thing, has that kind of wedge tail. I think some of the pulse tail baits from Savage Gear is pretty similar to that, where it's not a true boot tail or a straight tail or a brush tail even. So the boot tail I like if I really have to get that tail to engage because I'm fighting current, and that's coming downstream. If I'm coming up against current, it doesn't take a lot to get that tail to activate. So that's typically where your brush tails are going to be a little bit more effective. It also comes through and keeps the lure down, so it's not getting pushed up, through drag. The K-tails, I'll use those if I want a little more natural presentation where I don't need a lot of wobble. In situations like that, I'm typically throwing one of these. I like the NLBN. I'll throw it tight to rocks, and I want it to flow through the rocks, kind of like a bayfish that's been stunned. So yes, I do have definite opinion on that, and like spots that I will throw it versus others. It's also a really good follow-up lure. If I've thrown something that's like let's say a depth 250, a great big giant glide bait, pushes a lot of water, big profile, they can definitely feel it. We'll get follows, and if they don't commit or they don't seem that interested, I like to follow up with a softer presentation to get those less aggressive fish to come up and just take the easy meal. And a lot of it goes to really what I think is kind of a cardinal sin for most fishermen. Is we tend to think of what would the striper do, or what would the largemouth do, what would the smallmouth do, and we forget that we need to think about what their prey is going to do. Like, what would a shad do? What would a skipjack do? What would a sucker do? Well, I know what it wouldn't do to get eaten. That's what I want to imitate, because we've all seen it before, where you're trying to land a fish, and a much bigger fish comes and suddenly is interested in the fish you're trying to land. I mean, and that fish could have been sitting on the bottom, but now that you got something spazzing out, they're going to go see what's wrong. You see it all the time in saltwater. You got guys fighting marlin that gets attacked by a shark. Shark's typically not going to run up and eat a marlin. But when that marlin's on the end of the line and acting nuts, you'll have a smaller shark take a chunk out of it because it can. Something's wrong. And we do see that with stripers as well. I love when I can get a smaller striper actively engaged in my lure, because then I almost want to pull the lure from that fish and go back in because I just got that 40-incher excited. There's something going on. And some of the biggest fish I've seen in that river, which, some of them are going to push 50 pounds easily, they were nowhere present until I hooked a smaller fish, and I was excited about a 30-inch fish until I saw the 50-incher cruise under it. And I was like, well, that's the one I wanted to swim it away, but let me deal with this little shaker. It's 15-pound fish. Let me shake him off my hook real quick, see what I can do. And then that fish had no interest. So yeah, there are definitely times and places. Even some of the glide baits we use have a different action. Some stay up, some tend to track down, some have a wider swim, some have a bigger profile. Some definitely attract fish a lot more, but don't get bit. They just get followed. One of the ones that I love throwing right now is a Sneaky Pete by G-Rat. It's a 7-inch bait. There's no rattles. It's quiet. I'll start off throwing a depth 250, a Bait Sanity Explorer. That's a 9-inch bait. I have some baits that a buddy makes. This one's an 11-inch skipjack imitation. You can see it. That I'll throw this. It definitely moves fish, but they may not commit. If I follow up with that Sneaky Pete with a more erratic action because it's smaller, it gets crushed. So yeah, there's nuances in everything. So what are the fish doing? What are they reacting to? What kind of mood are they in? Can you piss them off enough for one? And then what is that limit of frustration? Saltwater, obviously, those fish are feeding a lot more. Our fish are kind of sitting around waiting for something to happen. They feed selectively when they want. They know where the food is, or they're in a river, so they're just waiting for food to come to them. And there's also a piece on cut bait on the bottom that I won't go into because I don't want anybody doing it.
I'll tell you a sort of cheater trick, and I did it by accident first, and then I realized, yeah, you can do this too. So if you know that you have both striper and bait fish in the same area, but they're not interacting, it's just not happening for whatever reason. No one's moving, no one's following, eating, nothing. I was like tackle jigging in the Chesapeake, in an area where I'm like, yep, there are good marks down there. Those are striper. There are smaller marks over here. Those are the bait fish. Those are the shad. And I was throwing a 1 ounce, actually might have been an 1.5 ounce jig head because there was current ripping through there. With a, I don't know, 8-inch soft plastic behind it. And just I'm banging around down where the where I can see the striper are, and just out of frustration, it sounds a lot like what Charlie did. I'm reeling it back up through the bait fish, and I hit one and I snag it and I fight him and I'm like, get out of here. And I throw it down there. And as soon as I throw back down in there,
came on.
All the striper just woke up. Right. And you can rip that jig head up through there and it hits them. What I've read is that they have a, almost like a pheromonal type, chemical they release in the school of bait fish where they say, we're being attacked. Oh no, watch out. And I think, probably the stripers smell that and they're like, sure. Oh, they are being attacked. Someone's eating. I think I'll eat too. Yeah. That injured bait fish by the angler's action ripping up through it can sometimes kick them off and wake them up, start them feeding.
100%. And those are usually your fun bites when you get that competitive feeding behavior. So if you can trigger one and they all get going, it kind of lives up to that definition of striper fishing, which is hours of boredom punctuated by moments of insanity. Mm-hmm. Just, you get that school going and you're like, oh man, I figured it out. And you catch 4 or 5 real quick, and then the school moves and they come back down, and then you got to find some way to get them agitated. And you're sitting there on a adrenaline high, shaking in the kayak, wondering where the next bite's going to come from. And those fish are kind of sitting on the bottom like, man, I'm done. Like, you can go on now. Thanks. So yeah, we've seen that. And I definitely agree with that. The craziest bite, or I guess not even bite, blitz I've seen on the river. There was a shoal and an osprey dove into it after some bait fish, and it must have spooked some downriver. And for the next, I'd say 10 minutes from one side of the river to the other, it looked like somebody's dropping cannonballs in the river. And we got down in there with them. And we're watching, it was, I don't know, 1.5 feet, 2 foot deep, and the water's gin clear. So you can count scales on the fish as they swim past you. There was probably 30 stripers cruising around, just blowing up everything, shad flying everywhere. And all the shad were 4 inches. Of course, I had an 8-inch swim bait on because that's what I was throwing. Couldn't buy a bite. And to the point where I pushed up against some brush just to get out of the main current. And I had 2 stripers swimming back and forth by the kayak, washing the shad that were under my kayak, just waiting for them to come back out. So I'm throwing lures and they'd follow and they'd look at it and be like, nope, that's not what I was after. So yeah, once one got going, man, that whole school turned on and it was fun to watch. It would have been a lot better to catch.
Yeah, it's weird how that works. I've gone through. I've actually found spots where I wouldn't have stopped to fish this way. There's a particular spot where Chris never thought to float down. There's an island in one of the rivers we fished, and he always went river right. And I was running river left. River left, it's a little bit more sketchy. There's a lot more blowdowns depending on the year. There might be a few strainers, so it's a little bit dicier of a run.
And shallow.
Yeah, and it's super shallow. Even when they're generating, it might be 5 or 6 feet deep. When they're not, it's a foot or two most years. And I just wanted to check it out one night, and I floated through, and me and Matt Cunningham floated through, and I had pushed a bunch of shad, and I watched those shad push about 5 feet in front of me, and then fish started blowing up, and they pushed back into my kayak, and one of the stripers ran into my kayak chasing those fish. We immediately pulled over and hooked up with which I lost 2, but hooked up on the last one and landed it. 3 fish, and I would have never thought to stop to fish that area, and now that's become one of our most consistent areas to catch fish.
Yeah. Well, me and Charlie, last time we fished together was a few weeks ago. That was the only spot in the river we caught fish. Overnight, we floated down, got there, and just started throwing lures into what looks like frog water outside the main current. And working small baits back top water, and I fell asleep in the kayak. I'm not gonna lie. I fell asleep on the kayak because it was late, and I woke up around 3 a.m. to Charlie yelling, fish, fish, fish. I'm like, what is he yelling about? I was trying to sleep, and yeah, the fish were going on, and it was just a weird spot. Bite was,
fish. He had caught 5 minutes. He had caught one. So when we first pulled up to that spot, he had caught one after 2 or 3 casts, landed it. I made 4 or 5 casts after that, and landed that one. And then it died. It died for about a half hour. And that's when, Chris said, well, I'm going to shut my eyes, wait for the sun to come up. So I cast it a few more times, nothing happened, and I thought, well, I'll sit down and shut my eyes as well. And I don't know how long I was out, but I heard something blow up, and I wasn't sure what it was because I was kind of half asleep. Sat up, and I heard something else blow up, and still wasn't real sure. Then I saw a big push, big wave push toward my kayak. I thought, okay, fish are moving. Chris is still asleep, so I got up and made 2 casts. And I hooked up, and those fish were active. I don't know if it was the same fish or it was different fish moving in and out.
I know for a fact it wasn't the same fish because one of those 3 that he caught choked a 10-inch glide bait.
Yeah.
How often do you guys like go out there and like stop and sleep on the river?
Every weekend.
Yep. most trips.
You guys have to watch some of the content I've made sleeping in the drifter hammock. It's a frame that I can set this thing up anywhere. Like I don't need flat ground. It takes 2 minutes to set up and to like, if you know, hey, we're going to camp on this pool. I don't know, man. I'll have to send you guys the link.
Yeah,
but it's something that we make at Boondocks, and it sets up really quick. And I've been doing a lot of island camping where I'll go for 2 days, and like I did it on the Juniata recently, and I did it somewhere in Missouri. And you run upstream and basically you camp on an island. But like for what you guys are doing to knock out like I don't know, how long are you sleeping? A couple hours?
Yeah, a few hours, 4 or 5 hours. If we get 5 hours, we're lucky. And yeah, by all means, send that link. And the reason why is I have a Wildy Recon 120. I love the seat in it, but a hammock sounds so much better.
Yeah.
Even more so now that I've turned 40. When I turned 40, I realized this stuff got a lot harder.
Wait till you turn 50, buddy. So, what I'm hearing here, it's not just finding the fish, right? Because it's one thing to find the fish. It's another thing to get them to eat sometimes. Because if they're not actively eating, people don't realize, because so many people hear the stories about hybrid bites, man. It's like intense. They're killing everything, but they're not hearing about, yeah, I found them, but I just couldn't get them to eat, because who is recording videos on fish not biting? Very few people, right? But that's a lot of this battle is not just finding them. It's tricking them, getting them to attack a bait, getting them to actually move. And I find that to be like what keeps me going in it, because I find them, but sometimes I just can't get them to eat. And like recently, I found them like what I was saying earlier, like just by spinning a small swim bait and seeing them come out. But the only way I got them to bite, and the funny thing was, it was only the big ones that bite this way. It wasn't just ripping it up off the bottom. It was literally getting it in the sweet spot where I saw them come out, drop the bait, reel all the way down to the water, and Babe Ruth it up. And the big ones would freak out and hit it. But if I spun it really slow and kept it moving, I'd catch like a 12 or a 19, somewhere in that range. But as soon as I started doing that, man, I was getting these ones, and every single one was breaking me off, or they were so powerful I couldn't keep up. They were just overwhelming the gear I had with me at the time.
It is
so I'm going back out tomorrow with heavier gear to that exact spot to do the exact same thing with the exact same bait, but with 50-pound braided line, with a 20-pound leader on it and a beefed up hook. So if it does happen that same way, but it was getting them to engage. It was getting them to fire up and chase the bait. And what it took was the fastest way I could possibly move the bait off the bottom was the only way I could get them, the bigger fish, to actually engage. And it was every single cat. When I figured it out, it was every single cast.
Yep.
By the time I'd get about 3/4 of the way lifting it up, Babe Ruth in it, I would just like, boom, and it'd just be a giant on every single time. And it was, and it just played into my mind for tonight. This happened earlier this week, exactly how hard of fishing these fish are, because they were down there the whole time. I probably spent 4 hours fishing there before I got what the bigger fish wanted and how they were eating. They were eating the exact same size bait that the smaller ones were, but I had to move it lightning fast to get them to react to it.
Yeah, I think it's breaking out of convention. That's true of a lot of fishing, though. Look at the things we're doing now. Like the hot bait on the bass circuit is a fuzzy dice.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it really is, because how many times have we been over these fish? Have other anglers been over these fish? Kayak angling is gotten huge, so there's a lot more people accessing or getting access to water they couldn't in the past. These fish don't have the havens like they used to. Forward-facing sonar has opened up a lot of windows for a lot of people. And just regular, even normal sonar, which that's what I use, that's advanced quite a bit from when we all started fishing. So those fish have been there. And a big striper will be old enough to remember the days before forward-facing sonar. So having to do something unconventional is usually what it takes to trigger a bite, and that's what led me to glide bait. So the rivers that I fish, I want to say I was the first one throwing glide baits, but I definitely was one of the first, to the point where people made fun of me. I looked like a crazy person, like, why are you throwing something that's 10 inches long? Like, are you going to eat that? Or that's as big as a fish I catch? All those comments. And it was a lure maker out in California. It was a buddy of mine. He sent me one of his baits that he sadly no longer makes. And it was a 10-inch single jointed glide bait. And I threw that and and I actually got it on video. I have a YouTube channel. It's Way of the Hook. There's not a lot on it. That one video is worth watching though. But caught it was about, I don't know.
Say the name of the channel again, please.
Way of the Hook.
Got it.
Yeah, it was about,
Thank you.
It was over 40-pound fish. And I saw the whole bite. So got it on camera. I got a follow, threw back in that area. Next cast, I saw the bite coming. And it got hit. Didn't realize it was that big until I got it to the kayak. But the video does the fish justice. It looks like a freaking shark in a river. But that's when I realized, hey, this might be a thing. And then I went more and more glide baits. Of course, back then it was hard to find those really big ones without going to boutique manufacturers, guys that make them in their garage and sell them for really high prices. But experimented more and more and realized that about 9 to 10 inches is kind of the magic size to trigger fish in my river until it gets later in the season, in which case you want to start dropping back down to probably 5 to 7 inches. There's the old standbys that still work, the cotton cordell redfin. I'm not sure what it is about that lure, but you throw it and you roll it back slow across the top, and stripers hit it like it owes them money. And that's true in the summer. It's true in the spring. It's true in the dead of winter when I'm fishing on flats in the middle of the night. It's 19 degrees out and I'm throwing a 5-inch redfin and crawling it on the surface, and then a 40-inch fish will come plaster it in 3 feet of water. Don't know why. I know why they're there, but I don't know why they hate that lure so much. And it kind of became a joke. I hated throwing it because everybody else was. So what can I do different?
Beginner lure.
Yeah, it's a beginner lure. Just throw it and wind it. Now, that being said, my daughter got one of her biggest fish on it, so I still go to it. I did. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I'll go to it when the bite stuff because I know it produces. But yeah, just getting away from the convention. Working baits way faster than you normally would. Most rods I'm using, I guess my fastest rod is a 7-to-1 year retrieve. It's the Okuma Komodo, the 400 size. I'm using that 65-pound braid, and I'm burning baits back, trying to elicit a reaction strike. I don't want that fish to see anything other than this is a bait fish coming off a shoal. It's spooked. It's trying to get away from a buddy. I better eat it before somebody else does. And just triggering that bite really, really works in freshwater. Now in winter, it's a lot slower. You're imitating just stunned shad, and the fish are pretty lazy. They're not going to chase a bait a long ways. There's a few places we have around here. We got warm water discharges that can be really, really good. Fantastic in times. You got a bite window that normally lasts about an hour. You can expect about a dozen fish between 30 and 40 inches in that hour. And then you just go home. Either the fishing slows down or your arms just hurt and you don't care anymore and you're done. You're happy. But it is using smaller stuff down to like a 4-inch sassy shad on a 1-ounce head and just letting the current barely push it along. I'm speaking Kurt's language now.
That's like my go-to, man.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be honest. It's like where I live, there's always small shad around.
Yeah. And those work. There's that old saying, elephants eat peanuts. So you can go really small. Fly fishing for stripers. My hybrids in particular, I like to go down to about 2 inches around this time of year because they're feeding on shad fry. Really, really, really small stuff. A lot of fun on an 8-weight. But bigger fish will mix in there. I've been in a fly fishing or in a pod of 2-inch bait, and I threw in a Rapala Countdown, the size 5 or size 3, little small thing, and had a 10-pound hybrid clock it, take me for a ride. So And I was catching 14-inch fish, and then that thing showed up. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, the bigger one's underneath. Let me just let it drop a little more. So yeah, it's get away from I have to do this or I have to do that. This is a bait. This is a bait, because everybody has their favorite lure. It's all dependent. Bucktails, fantastic. You can use them everywhere. Very, very versatile. Saltwater and fresh, still water, moving water, it doesn't matter. Those things work. And you can tailor what you want based on what you add on to it. If it needs to be big, add a Zoom mag fluke is really good. 7 inches long, super flukes, not bad at 5 inches, pretty standard. You can go down to the tiny fluke on a really small one. If you need a really small action, or if you got small fish that are keying on really small stuff like sand eels, things like that, saltwater, and really, really small shad.
So are you always putting a trailer on your bucktails?
If I want to bulk up the body, yes. A lot of times I'll go I call it naked bucktail. If I'm fishing heavy current, I don't need anything else on there. The current's going to do all the job for me. That bucktail's going to move. Some fibers will do its own thing, so I won't then. And also, if I'm fishing those areas, they're normally really snaggy, and bucktails can get expensive on their own. Adding a 7-inch mag fluke on the end gets expensive even more. So try to keep costs down. Yeah, it's been an adventure. I mean, anybody looking for a challenge, I recommend doing that, and then do what everybody else is doing, and then look for things that they're not. Look at the techniques used out in the West Coast. The guys fishing for big bass out there, a lot of those lures started as striper lures. They just realized, hey, these catch big bass too, and that approach works really, really well. Saltwater, you're starting to see some of that bleed over as well. So I have a work trip coming up to New York. I was going to be going to the Montauk area in October, but that changed, so I don't get to do that. And me and my boss are not on speaking terms right now because of it. He's sending me to Albany, which I'm probably going to fly in a day early and take the rental car out to Montauk. That's kind of one of my mecca places. I have Sacramento coming up middle of October, which is another place I want to go out in California. And then here pretty soon, I'm going to be out in Kurt's neck of the woods. So I'm going to go pilfer all your fish.
Yeah, come on up, brother.
I'm bringing gear. I'll be bringing gear. But no, it's like everything's going to be different, but there's a lot of similarities to it. So a lot of those techniques that work on one side of the country will work on the other. It's just who's going to be the person to try it. And even here in my own state, out in different parts of the state, I've taken techniques that I've done here and gone out there and caught fish and realized nobody's doing this. These are uneducated fish, because they see a bunch of boats, they see a lot of bait, they see a lot of the same lures. You bring something different, and now they act like a teenage boy who's never seen a supermodel before. It's like, oh my gosh, I want that. And they go nuts. And I'm kind of sitting back thinking, like, this is so hard. I don't get half these bites back home, but here I've got 6 fish fighting their way to the kayak, and I hooked 2 of them. Or I hooked one and it got off, and then it hit again. So yeah, it's just break out of convention. And don't be afraid to venture into something new, or if it seems crazy, it's probably going to work at some point. And then there's a whole different avenue. If you start getting into the musky stuff, some of those musky lures can be sleeper striper baits. Like the dock is absolutely one of them. That's probably the front runner whenever I think of that.
I mean, to add what you said, I mean, I know locally there was a local lake years ago. They had a fish kill and it messed up the lake. But years ago, it was like a really amazing hybrid lake for us. We were catching 28s out there on a regular, especially when she kind of learned what to do. And what you said, it kind of stuck with me just now, like do something different. And everybody, all the motorboats, this is at a time when there was like maybe 3 kayaks on the lake. I mean, almost nobody was kayaking. It was all motorboats. And they were all doing the same thing, trolling the same areas, using the same baits, and I was just like, I got tired of being in the merry-go-round, because I'm in a paddle kayak. I'm like wearing myself out doing what they're doing. So I started just like scooting off to the side and using more subtle baits. And quite honestly, we had just talked about moving a bait really fast. I started doing the opposite and really slowing it down a lot. And I started finding that they were a different bite, that by them trolling certain areas, they would ultimately push the fish out into these other little spots that they weren't able to like see or target very well because it wasn't a trolling area. And just doing something different, like you said, you see everybody doing one thing, man. It's like sometimes it's best to do a 180 from what they're doing and just take a look at what's happening elsewhere. And you can really key in on some stuff that way with baits, whether it's a musky bait, a saltwater bait or freshwater bait, taking it and crossing them over can have giant effects.
I will troll a lot shallower in the spring than any of the other bigger boats will even attempt to. And I'll mix it up in areas that have, isolated like riprap rocks and just places that if you have a nice, I don't know, Parker or whatever center console that you have out on the bay, you're not getting near that area. So that kind of resonates with what you just said, Kurt, in terms of going places that other people won't. And the kayaks can. Mm-hmm. Like if I have a big boat wake from like a container ship rolling up to Baltimore to unload whatever, and there's a big, 7-foot rise and fall, of that big container ship. Like if I end up on the rocks, it sucks, and I'm probably gonna get, busted up on my elbows a little bit. But like if that center console is in that situation, like their boat's done. They're just done.
Yeah, his day's shot pretty bad.
Oh, their boat's done. Yeah, you got holes in it. So I get shallower in the spring. I love fishing in 6 feet of water or less, and just letting the hard bait dig and bang, and I get into places that kayakers can get, but the big boats won't, if they
opens up opportunity.
Know it's good for them. Yeah,
right. The kayak's opening up those opportunities.
Yep.
Well, guys, we ran a little bit over an hour. I want to be respectful of all your guys' times. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing knowledge with everybody. I think this is going to be a really popular episode for people who want to go out, especially obviously fishing for stripers. Jeff, I'll give you a chance to say thank you to your sponsors or whoever you want to say thank you to.
I'm going to say thank you to my employer, Boondocks. We manufacture, it's all metal-based manufacture in Thomasville, North Carolina. None of it is made overseas. It's all made by our fellow Americans in Thomasville, North Carolina. Kayak fishing accessories. We're actually moving into and expanding our, I will say, truck and trailer rigging accessories, and also camping. And you could also say overlanding in that vein. But a lot of the content that's on my YouTube channel, the little stuff, really shows off that stuff. I've been staying in a rooftop tent quite a bit this year, and I mentioned the drifter hammock. We make gearboxes for keeping all of our stuff secure, and we're actually starting to make metal rod lockers, which we have a 6 and then a 16 capacity Rod Pro coming out. It's actually available now. So yeah, a lot of fun things happening at Boondocks.
And highly recommend everybody check out Jeff's channel. So much good information on it.
Thank you, Kurt.
Chris, you want to?
So yeah, I've been affiliated with Wilderness Systems for a few years now. That's the one company I do work with. So love the products they did. I started with the Attack 120. Kind of fell in love with that kayak, and then I got the Recon and fell in love with that one too. So it's for me, what I've been looking for is just something that I can fish out of that's going to have a clean layout. That's really important to me when you're chasing a big fish in a river. You've got to react fast. Things can go bad in a hurry. So having that kind of space and everything, I really like that. So I also want to give a shout out to them, and then also want to thank my wife who's manning all the get our daughter to volleyball practice duties, so I can be here. And I'm supposed to have dinner ready, and I'm probably not. So I'm hoping she's forgiving as well.
I'm sorry. Charlie, how about you, man?
Well, of course, I want to thank my employer, Jackson Kayak, for giving me a paycheck so I can spend all my money on fishing stuff. Obviously, giving me a sweet discount on a lot of nice kayaks to get in and chase these fish. A lot of different variety of kayaks. Of course, I have a river kayaks for what me and Chris do. If they're pumping a bunch of water out of the dam, I'll take the Blue Sky up there. It's a boat stability with a kayak capabilities. So best of both worlds. So definitely thank them. Of course, gotta thank my wife, because there's a lot of nights where she's doing double duty for the same reason Chris's wife is because we're out there,
Because you're together.
we're together, putting in 17-hour river trips. So they definitely have a lot to put up with when it comes to us. But just the industry in general, I love the kayak industry. I've met Jeff. I've met a lot of other anglers that paddle different brands, and regardless of brands that we paddle, it all feels like a family. So that's what I really like about where we are, what we do.
Yeah, so much of it is about community, for sure. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on tonight. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we will see you all next week.
See y'all.
See you guys.